Welcome to this session, and as Salman Tariq Qureshi has pointed out, I have trouble in understanding the forums at the end, but here it goes. It's called Pakistani Authors and Global Literary Forums, or Fora, whatever it should be called, but probably we understand what we mean. At least the Pakistani authors part is as clear as it could be. I would like to request my speakers today to introduce themselves and do more justice to their credentials than I could, because I would be getting more information from them. So Claire, maybe we can begin with you.
Hello, I'm Claire Chambers. I'm a lecturer at Leeds Metropolitan University in the north of England. My PhD was on Amitav Ghosh, the Indian Bengali writer based in the US, but now for quite a long time I've been very interested in Pakistani writing in English, and more specifically I've become very interested in the new category of Muslim writing, which is sort of coming into use more and more. And so last year I recently wrote this book, British Muslim Fiction. So in the talk I'll talk a bit more about that. But yeah, I'm basically a lecturer and a researcher in Leeds.
And a critic.
And a critic.
Right. Madeline?
I suppose I'm the same, but perhaps a slightly different. I suppose I come from a similar background, except that I'm at a slightly different stage. I'm currently writing a PhD that looks at three contemporary Pakistani writers in English and one South Asian Indian novelist, really, and the fictions they've produced in the course of the last decade or so, really inspired by the 9/11 point as a point to which may have been a cause of inspiration or a reason to write back to a Western world. So that's the way that I'm predominantly spending my time at the moment. I'm also a critic for the Times Literary Supplement back at home in London, and currently based in Lahore for the next 2 months at the National College of Arts Research and Publication Centre, where I'm developing a small project on representations of violence, but trying to marry up the artwork that's being produced by the students there, these global literary novels that I'm looking at as part of my doctoral research, and think through some of the ideas about the global and the local and issues of representation, who we represent, which society, for and why. So hopefully that will become a bit clearer as I give you a sense of what I'll be talking what I'm doing at the moment in greater detail.
Thank you very much, Madeline. That's quite interesting, and I hope that we will be able to talk about your research interest in the work that you're doing. But let me now turn back to Claire, and I find that the topic of your book and the way you have named it quite intriguing. So I would like you to unpack this a little bit further. I understand British fiction, right? But where does the Muslim part come in, and exactly what kind of writers are we talking about, and what categorizes them as a group, that you should look at them as a whole? So is there a group identity in being Muslim and British and a fiction writer?
Sure. Yeah, I hope I'll cover most of those questions in the talk, because it's quite a controversial thing that I'm doing in some ways, because I'm very interested in the category of new Pakistani writing in English, which anyway is a controversial term, because obviously Pakistani writing in English has been around since even pre-1947. Mumtaz Shahnawaz, Ali Ahmed, there's a lot of people, Zulfikar Ghosh, there's Babsi Sidwa, but there's a real flowering of Pakistani writing at the moment, which I'm sure Madeline is going to talk about. But I became interested because my context is Britain, and I'm from Leeds, and so the project really began in 2005 when the London bombings took place, and you'll remember that 3 out of 4 of the bombers were from Beeston in South Leeds, or had strong connections with my city. And so I was in Canada at the time, and everybody was asking me, what's it like, what's Leeds like? They were really shocked that this had happened on British soil. And, I had spent a year in Pakistan in 1993 to 94 when I was teaching English as a teenager in Peshawar. I had lots and lots of Pakistani friends in Leeds, but but probably similarly to Karachi, there's a big there's a north-south divide. I don't know if it's a west-east divide here, but usually there's a divide in a city, and there's class divides. My friends were mostly middle class or maybe elite class people, very educated and westernized. But in other parts of the city, there's ghettos. There's a lot of racism, and I was shocked, that this could happen in my own city, and I thought I knew. I had a lot of friends and I understood this culture. So also I'd had kids, so I wasn't able to come back and forth to Pakistan and India as I used to do. So in a way I wanted to study my own country and communities on my doorstep, and so the project began. And I suppose it's a very difficult thing to talk about British Muslim writers. I do it with unashamedly called the book British Muslim Fictions, but in a way that's a play on words, because in a way I'm saying that is this a fiction? Is the category of British Muslim in a way a fiction? Because how are we deciding this? Is it based on religious zeal or piety, or is it about civilization, culture? There's the big debate in Islamic studies about, is Islam a civilization or is it a religion? Can it be both? Should we unpack those categories?
But it's certainly not fiction.
But this debate has not been going on in fiction much at all. So I wanted to think about that. I think I probably am I'm not a practicing Muslim, although I'm very interested in Sufism. I've learned a lot from doing the research, and I'm really, more and more drawn to Islam. But, I'm not qualified to talk about people's piety, and I don't want to put writers on a scale according to, religiosity. So for me, it's about background, about civilization, and about having maybe an insider's view of Islam. Because, the other point about the title British Muslim Fictions is that a lot of fictions are told about Muslims in the UK, by the media, by academics, I'm afraid to say. But in many walks of life, we hear a very distorted picture about Islam. And so, in a way, that was one thing the book was trying to do, was to actually talk to Muslim writers. And actually, the other point is that writers of Muslim descent based in Britain are doing incredibly well. They're rising, they're getting more attention all the time. So, many of them are here. The British contingent are at the festival. Hanif Qureshi, you all know. But there's also young, up-and-coming writers, not necessarily of a Pakistani background, but Robin Yassin Kassab, from his British Syrian writer who's here. But there's other people like Abdul Razak Gurna, who's from Zanzibar, and Ada Swaif, an Egyptian writer who was at Tahrir Square and has just written a big book on Tahrir Square. And actually, these people talk to each other. They are friends. They write about each other. So, in a way, any discussion of literature is based on constructs. So, often we've talked about South Asian writers, and so you put writers of Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, Nepali background on a platform together, which makes a lot of sense in many ways. But what I'm saying is, 1947 is a long time ago. Perhaps India and Pakistan have moved, apart in many ways. So there's still a lot of shared values and cultures, but there's different languages, different civilization. And Pakistan is different from India because it faces west. It has connections in Central Asia, in the Arab world, and in Persia, in Iran, and even East Africa, because of Islam and because of the civilizational connections and money and links. And so, to me, it's not meant to be a constricting box to put writers in, but maybe to open up a different perspective on British Pakistani writers, to look at them in conjunction with writers. And you see many shared themes. I noticed recurring themes, and things that go against the fictions we're fed about Muslims every day. Cosmopolitanism, the sort of openness and intertextuality, the interest in Muslim Spain and Al-Andalus is common to writers of Pakistani background, from the Arab world, from East Africa. There's a lot of pride and there's a lot of dignity there that gets overshadowed every day. Have I had 10 minutes?
No, you still have time,
Okay.
but I wanted to ask you a question, if I may, so that you can continue on this. From what you just said, I would like to maybe dissect out two different components. One is which you mentioned, fictions about Muslim Britishers, or right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is the kind of fiction they actually write, which is a literary product.
Yeah.
So first of all, can we differentiate between the two, and do they have a bearing on each other?
So the question is that there's
And
two
frankly,
things.
do Muslims write a different kind of fiction?
Yeah. So it's a very good question, and I think in the first book my criterion was I interviewed 13 writers from including people like Tariq Ali, who is not, he's an atheist, a declared atheist, but he's written an Islam quintet, so and he's very knowledgeable about the civilization of Iran, and he's very outspoken about what he calls the clash of fundamentalisms. The sort of Bush-Blair war in Iraq is one kind of fundamentalism, and which he's vehemently opposed to, and then Islamism, violent Islamism, he's also opposed to. So I included writers like that, which is quite controversial. He's not in any way a typical Muslim, but then also practicing Muslim writers like Layla Abu Layla from Sudan, who wears hijab and is very devout, and her books always, as they're not in any way sort of religious tracts, but they have a religious component. So there was a whole spectrum, and I wouldn't say there is such a thing as a Muslim voice, but it doesn't mean it's not a valuable exercise. I mean, is there such a thing as a woman's voice? There was this debate has been going on for decades, the idea of écriture féminine, female writing the body, it's the jury's out. There might be some evidence, there may not be, but it's still interesting to think of women writers together, as long as you don't only think of them as women writers, but you also think of them as perhaps Pakistani writers or Muslim writers. And similarly, I think with the category of Muslim writing, it's something to add into the mix. It's not meant to say you shouldn't consider ethnicity or nationality anymore, but I think there are shared tropes and interest in Quran. The Yusuf story came up more than once in Pakistani writers like Amir Hussain and Suhail Sadi, a Scottish Pakistani writer, have written about Yusuf. But then also Abdul Razak Gurnah has rewritten the Yusuf story towards the end of his novel Paradise. So that's a writer from Zanzibar. Of course, East Africa has always had close links with British India, as was, and because of the Indian Ocean and trade routes. So it seems a shame to sort of put East Africans in a box of African writing, when they might be very different from Nigeria and so on. All boxes have their limits, and so I think it's a very good question. It's one that I can't fully answer. But my second book is going to purely look at literary representations of Muslims in Britain. So a lot of the first writers, they're based in Britain at the time that I interviewed them, but maybe they don't write about Britain. Like Kamala Shamsi writes mostly, she hasn't written much about, occasionally a character will pass through London, but there isn't much about Britain, more about Pakistan, Japan, America, all sorts of places. She's very international, but she's based in Britain. So I interviewed her. In the second book, I'm going to trace representations of Muslims in Britain since the 1960s, with discussion of, as well as fiction, there will be discussion of film and poetry, and also the politics of publishing, what it's like to be a Muslim writer in the UK. And I argue, along with many other people, that if you're a religious Muslim, there's automatically, especially if you're a woman writer, automatically a hijab on the cover, or even if the text is not really looking at that at all, then might even very exoticized women on the cover, mostly with veils. But if you're very much defining yourself as a multicultural writer, there tends to be a sort of Indo-chic, hands with henna painted on, saffron and beautiful sari material. But there's nothing really in between. So that's something I'm working on at the moment, is sort of talking about book cover images, blurbs, the number of times the words faith and religion appear on the back covers and things, because I think there's a real demand in the West, especially since 9/11 and since the London bombings, to find out more. And I know that in Pakistan and elsewhere, some people have a problem with the writers in English, and there's a sort of people talking about apologist literature, or Pakistani writers in English sort of holding up a bad image to the West. So that might be something we could talk about in the questions. I think, as Hanif Qureshi said yesterday, that writers don't do PR, and but there is an argument sometimes, should there be a certain amount of self-censorship, as with the satanic verses that we're not meant to mention but keeps coming up, did Rushdie have to go that far, and was all the pain and hurt necessary? So there's some very interesting questions around the topic, but I might leave it.
That's you've mentioned several interesting names, people like Tariq Ali and Abdurrazzaq Gurna, whose novel Paradise I greatly admire, and you also mentioned Sohail Sadi, whose book Joseph Box. It's a very intriguing book and very much relevant to Pakistan because it has a whole portion based in Lahore, and I wish that book had been better known in Pakistan. But I wonder if you bring together writers as diverse as Tariq Ali and Sohail Sadi and Abdurrazzaq Gurna, so are we talking about a whole category of Muslim writers, or writers who simply happen to be writers as well as Muslims?
I think
Which is the trope here?
I think it's more writers that probably happen to be Muslim, and I'm more interested in the figure of the Muslim. A lot of them are not writing about Muslim themes, although I flagged up Yusuf, that does come up a lot. But many writers are more interested in what it means to be a Muslim in Britain today, religious or not religious. And there's a class dimension as well, because Muslims in Britain that tend to be amongst the lowest, paid, the highest unemployment. The only people in probably a worse situation are young Afro-Caribbean males.
That's right.
But then Bangladeshi, Pakistani in Britain are, and there's an extra layer of discrimination post 9/11, and lots of draconian laws. The prevent strategy, sort of looking for extremists has been, has led to persecuted communities and a lot of anger. So there are writers like, for example, a less well-known Pakistani in Britain called Zahid Hussain, who's written a book called The Curry Mile, based in Manchester. And he is actually a very devout Muslim, very involved in Manchester Council of Mosques. However, the book is a very lively and quite racy love story, because he is, first and foremost, he wants to write, and he's had some criticism from the community. But he said, because in the book, a Muslim girl falls in love with a Hindu boy and lives with him out of wedlock, which a lot of people didn't like. But he says, well, I don't think that art that is trying to push a religious agenda is really art. So there's the whole debate around that as well. And then there is a thriving Muslim publishing industry with boarding school books about little girls going to Muslim schools, and they may not be great art, but there's a very interesting sort of emergence of pious literature as well.
Great. I would like to come back to this issue of publishing, but I want to move on to Madeline next, because we've been talking about a larger theoretical construct on Muslim writers or Muslim writing. And Madeline, in your work, you've explored at very specific writers. So can you talk about more of your research work, the writers that you have focused, and what diversity and what commonalities you have found there?
I'll try. I just wanted to start really with a quotation, which I feel gives a sense of where I'm coming to when I look at the writers that I'm looking at as part of this wider research project that I'm doing. Last week, Shada Islam wrote in Dawn that Pakistan, with its multiple facets, stark contrasts, and colourful, complex realities, intrigues and fascinates the rest of the world. And it seems never more so than now, and over the course of the last decade, certainly from where I'm coming from, in London and in England, and therefore the West. It's certainly my consciousness of this fact, of this interest in Pakistan, is why I'm here today in Karachi, and it's bound up with the perspectives that I bring to Pakistani English language fiction, which is really my sole focus at the moment. The project I've been working on over the last 3 years now looks at issues of representation in contemporary South Asian Muslim fiction. My specific focus is on Pakistani writers in English, but I do begin my work with a look at Salman Rushdie. I then move on to look at Nadim Aslam, Kamila Shamsi, and Mohsin Hamid. So South Asian Muslim fiction is a broader term to to encompass those writers, but the predominant focus is Pakistanis. And I'm sure that we can discuss terminology, but I do want to go on and tell you a bit more about the body of the work that I do, because Asif is right, it particularly focuses on the novels produced by these writers, and there is a strong element of literary criticism and of real mining of those texts that I want to get onto, just to set the terminology aside for a moment. So my project looks at these issues of representation. Since the 2001 World Trade Center attacks, a militant jihadist Islam has been brought sharply into world view. Since then, many Western fictions have tried to map the Islamic world that's thought to have produced the bombers. There are novels by Updike, DeLillo, Martin Amis, for example, or stories at least. I'm looking at how contemporary South Asian and Muslim Pakistani writers' fictional representations of Muslims' connection to and disconnection from a range of global spheres may offer this more nuanced perspective of what it is to be Muslim today. Issues that inform my work are issues around things like the framing of Muslims, i.e. the representation of Muslims after 9/11. I'm working with a chap called Peter Morey, who's headed up a whole research network in the UK, which looks at how Muslims have been framed or represented in culture and society from the media, film, the radio, whether the first thing you hear when it's a subject about Islam on the radio is a prayer call, citizenship tests, how those frame a particular legitimate sense of what it is to be Muslim in the UK today. So these wider concepts inform the way that I look at the literature that I'm looking at, and the specific connections of the Muslim characters within these world novels, because a world novel, or a novel with a global focus, with a range of characters who cross continents and fall in love and fall out of love and so on, does allow for a range of different identifications with aspects of those cultures they encounter, both Muslim and non-Muslim. I'm straying slightly, so I'd like to go back and just say that other ideas that obviously inform my work are trends in contemporary Pakistani writing in English, which we've heard so much about at this festival, and in a sense, all the ideas that I've been coming across here are going to flood my mind, complicate my thinking, and I will take them home with me, and that will definitely inform the way that I'm looking at this writing. There's this question also that comes into play here about to what extent writers today, who are Pakistani writers in English, are maybe pandering to what Mohsin Hamid has called catering to a desire to dine out on Pakistani cuisine in the West. Wider ideas of post-colonial and international or world literature production, so ideas about also how far a transnational elite, say, can be said to speak for a particular culture from which they originally hail, or offer windows onto the world of ordinary people within it, are important too, and how their novels may revise or reorient or replace contemporary perceptions and stereotypes about, so Pakistanis and Muslims in this case today, not just counter them, but actually really negotiate them and rewrite them to make us think more subtly. So it also contributes to wider thinking about where the direction of South Asian and Muslim writing in English is going today. But it does specifically focus on Aslam, Hamid, Rushdie and Shamsi, and how the world literature that they craft, its form, its style and so on, shapes this emerging genre of world fiction, which maps multicultural and cosmopolitan connections which extend beyond these assumed bounds of nation, faith, culture and so on. Would you like me to continue? Or?
I would certainly like you to continue, but I just would like to pose a question also, maybe both of you can answer. would be that the interest that you define and describe in the whole notion of being Muslim and being a center of fiction, does that originate from 9/11 and attacks against the so-called from these jihadis, etc.? Is that a defining point, a turning point, or has that generated a great deal of fictional interest in Pakistan?
Can I go first?
Yeah.
For me personally, in terms of my own narrative, I was 21 in 2001 and have a personal memory. We all, I think a lot of people have a personal memory associated with that time, which, do you want me to indulge or shall I carry on?
No, please.
Yeah. No, my partner then was Muslim from the Maldives, and we watched the attacks. We then went to pass through Frankfurt Airport to visit my father on the way. He got separated into a different queue, was being asked, where are you travelling, why? And I wanted them to ask me too, because I felt that the stereotyping was right then and there, based purely on the way that someone looked and what passport they were carrying. And so this interest, and more than interest, this suspicion, immediate suspicion, and the sort of legitimization of that suspicion on the grounds of security, shook me. So yes, 9/11 has an impact, but in beginning to research the work that I was doing, I read back through all sorts, including Edward Said, for example, and he has a moment in Covering Islam, which first came out in 1981, where he describes the response to the 1995 Oklahoma bombings. And he expresses his concern also in this work about the malicious generalizations about Islam, which have become acceptable as a form of denigration of foreign culture in the West. He says that after the 1995 Oklahoma bombings, he received 25 phone calls. The entirely facetious connection between Arabs, Muslims, and terrorism was never more forcibly made evident to me. The sense of guilty involvement which I was made to feel struck me. And I think that same, obviously this predates 9/11, but a similar sentiment is coming out, particularly being expressed by writers including Kamala Shamsi, for example, of what do you do about this sense of guilty involvement when there's nothing that you have to feel guilty about, but that is being placed upon particular people and community, and there is a desire therefore to stand up and respond. So there are preceding moments, but this is the moment for me and us in our time, and I think for the Pakistani writers that I've been looking at in my work.
Yeah, and that is a great defining moment, and probably something which contributes to the sense of identity. And I wonder if, Claire, you have a sense of that too, something originating from 9/11, at least interest in looking at how this particular group is constructed, what kind of identity markers can be used, and how they can be categorized as a subject of fiction.
Well, I think 9/11 was a big event, but more because of what happened afterwards. I think it was the war on terror that was really the defining moment of our age. I mean, as terrible and as hideous and wrong as 9/11 was, the aftermath was far more terrible, and it's the aftermath that you're talking about. I mean, and everybody knows people who've had horrible times at airports, but much worse things are happening as well. And the wars that are going on, and possible invasion of Iran on its way. So I think that's it's been an ongoing turning point since 2001. But also going further back, you mentioned Covering Islam, and I was thinking of Said as well, because for him the turning point was the Iranian Revolution and the stereotypes. In America, it was Iran that was the big deal, and stereotyping really, I mean, it's existed for centuries, as Orientalism tells us, but it became very bad after 1979, and so that was maybe America's first turning point. In Britain, it was probably 1989 and the Satanic Verses Affair that really drew attention to Muslims in Britain. Actually, in the 90s, long before 9/11, writers like Zadie Smith and Hanif Qureshi, and Arif Swaif at Abdul Razak Gurna were talking about these issues. You can never name just one turning point. Obviously 9/11 and the war on terror are extremely important, but it goes further back.
Okay, yes, Medley.
No, all I was going to say was obviously Mohsen Hamid talks about the reluctant fundamentalist and how the story was there before 9/11, for example. I just think that 9/11 has been a galvanising point, particularly when you come from where I come from, in there being interest. And then 7/7 for us in London was another, the London tube bombings. But yes.
So both 9/11 and 7/7 were galvanizing points, yes. But what it seems to have done is also created a commercial interest in things which are beginning with the M word, right? Everything has to be packaged in a certain way, and probably there's more interest in. Oh, I'm sorry. I used the M word, and maybe that contributed to the lack of being heard. Anyway, I can say that again. I was just commenting on picking up from the point which two my panelists have said, that 9/11 and 7/7 were galvanizing points. Yes, but what seems to have also happened is that it created a commercial interest on the behalf of what we call the global market on what are things from the M side of the view, what makes the mindset of a jihadi or a mindset of a Pakistani, so people like John Updike suddenly being interested in what lies inside a terrorist, and after having written books like on the Witches of East Side and married couples, etc., there's suddenly a new interest which this, I'm not being facetious about him. Maybe I should ask, rather than make my own comment, ask you as to what is the commercial interest in Muslims, Pakistanis, and how has that become also an important market source which feeds, nourishes, or defines the writers?
I mean, the way I see it is that since 9/11, a lot of people woke up to something that they hadn't really thought about before. And writers like John Updike, who you mentioned, very quickly wrote novels that weren't terribly well researched. Martin Amis also wrote, The Last Days of Muhammad Atta, which is a terrible short story. And who else? Sebastian Faulks has got in on the game with A Week in December, which is also pretty bad. And Salman Rushdie wrote Shalimar the Clown, which I'm not too fond of, although I know you may have a different view. So there's a lot of. So my view is that it's the big boys, and they're all men, interestingly. But in a way, it's to get a marker as a serious novelist. People are jumping to talk about this issue that they perhaps don't know all that much about. But I think there is an impatience with that, and a sense that perhaps this is quite limited. I noticed that in these mainstream writers, they kept quoting the line from the Quran about God being closer than your jugular vein, seemed to be the only surah anybody knew at all. So I think there is also demand for. Aman Malik talks about, it says, writers of Muslim narratives, he talks about Muslim narratives, they show us Islam from the inside. But there is a problem with that as well, and I think coming to Pakistan makes you realise that there's a whole question of authenticity, actually, and we might happily assume that Nadeem Aslam, Mohsen Hamid, Kamala Shamsi, Muhammad Hanif, and Daniel Mouinideen, the big five are, authentic spokespeople, and they are in a way, but authenticity is a very problematic concept anyway, and they're just giving a perspective. But I prefer that to the mainstream writers who just seem to be doing it and making controversial statements, almost to get a controversy, to fan the flames and to say, look, I've arrived, I'm one of the big boys. And that's what I definitely think Sebastian Faulks was doing, because he's not really in the same sort of name recognition league as Salman Rushdie, for example, but he gets in on the game.
So probably this theme also contributes to a number of mediocre or poorly researched works, you say. But I'm intrigued by the fact that you do not mention Hanif Qureshi's My Son the Fanatic. And is that something that you see in the same category, in the same group, or is there a different? Because of course Hanif Qureshi is probably more British than, say, some of the writers whom you've mentioned.
It's a good question. I did mention Hanif Qureshi in the 90s interest in Islam. Well, it's difficult because he's a friend, and he's not here though, so I can say what I want.
I promise I'll not quote it to him.
Okay. I don't love that. I like the film. I didn't love the short story. I thought it was quite simplistic, and I told him so more or less. And I think that's a good example actually. I think Hanif and Salman and Martin Amis and these people, to some extent, they've got quite a black and white view. And actually, Hanif Qureshi said to me yesterday that he thought the thing about religion is its dogma and it's so certain, it's so sure of itself. And I said, I don't think that's true. I think there are some parts of Islam, as there are some parts of, evangelical Christianity is exactly the same, But there's also strands of Islam that make room for questioning and ijtihad and doubt, and he said, and he hadn't really thought about it before. So I think that there's sort of a discourse that you can get sucked into without really thinking about it. I think My Son the Fanatic is a well-written piece, but I think it's problematic politically.
It is problematic, even as literature. Madeline, do you have a comment on that?
No, not that specifically,
Okay.
more to go back to the original
Okay.
question.
Well, I think as you've asked really about the response to there being a commercial aspect to this, a demand or an interest in a sense, a kind of new, we've talked a lot in the past in things like post-colonial studies about exotica and erotica coming from the Orient and pleasing the Occident. And in a sense, I've been thinking about whether the response has been for a kind of new version of that specifically looks at the sort of titillation of terror and that sort of thing. I think where the writers appear to be coming from and the way that I understand their work is in a sense a response to this, a sort of to have a twin focus, to be a response partly to a demand from publishers, etc., for a particular kind of material, but also a genuine and a very personal response to attempt to respond to a situation that has got out of hand in terms of the ways that Muslims and particularly South Asian Muslims in the UK, for example, have been represented. So in attempting to respond to this demand and interest in a kind of writing about Muslims that will in a sense help get you inside the head of that suicide bomber, there has been the development of literature that really intervenes, experiments in form and style, to offer a fresh perspective when all the perspectives and the discourse is currently being recycled over and over and limited. So that's why I've been developing in the work that I've been doing concepts of Muslim and affiliation and affinity in this contemporary world literature. So if it's a literature that is situating Muslims in different parts of the globe, feeling a connection to home, if that's Pakistan, but also perhaps to the peer who's currently located in Australia and you call him there, or a sense there's one of the characters in Nadim Aslam's Maps for Lost Lovers, for example, who describes her, she's contemplating moving back to Pakistan because her husband wants her to, and she says, I won't move to Pakistan, what would my life be then? My children in England, me in Pakistan, my soul in Arabia, and my heart. And she stops and she thinks about where her heart might be and whether that's the same place as her soul or not. And in this case there's a compromise, if anyone knows the novel. But it's those novels then, after 9/11, that are attempting to diversify those Muslim connections that are the deeper felt ones than just the sort of aesthetic, sophistic ones that might be matched by someone like Rushdie. That that is the source of my interest. And to go back to Armin Malik, who Claire was mentioning earlier, he describes a need for a literary fiction which will meet the challenge of incorporating Islamic subjectivities and cultural practices into a world of equal differences. And he wrote about that need in 2000, but I think, again, it's never more current than now.
Yeah, it's become more relevant. I would just like to pose the last question from my side before I open the floor for discussion. It's something which both of you have mentioned in different contexts, and this is the issue of authenticity. The writers whom you mentioned, Kamila Shamsi, Mohsen Ahmed, Nadeem Aslam, as representing an authentic voice which is coming from inside the point of view. But in a place like Pakistan, these writers are sometimes seen to be suspicious because they're writing for a Western audience in a Western language. So probably seen to be less authentic than they would seem to be to a British audience. And I wonder if you have a view of that. So the question is for both, or any of you which would like to begin.
I've been speaking for a little, so would Claire like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this. I mean, really, what is authentic? It's a very weird thing to think about, but you know, a person is authentic to their own experiences, and you know, I think Maniza, who's just left, but you know, Maniza Shamsi talks about it's quite hard to separate diasporic Pakistani writers from Pakistani writers, because most Pakistani writers have spent some time in the diaspora. Some divide their time between Pakistan and another country. Some live here all the time, but were born and brought up elsewhere. You know, so you have Pakistanis in Karachi with, you know, writers with American accents, but live in Karachi. You have writers living in the West with strong Punjabi accents. You know, authenticity it's a problematic term, and I don't think writers are journalists or academics. They're not trying to present the truth, they're just trying to present a truth. I think some of the writers are more or less politically sound, you know, but in a way you could still think a writer is a fantastic writer even if you think their politics are dubious. We think of Saul Bellow, for example. It seems like a very nasty man, but he's a great writer in the States. So
he's a great favourite.
Yeah, he's great. Nadeem Aslam, I didn't like Wasted Vigil, but I love Maps for Lost Lovers, even though I think he overlaid so many problems in this, and it's the town, really, it's Huddersfield, which is the next town from Leeds. I know it very well. And he said, well, all these things have happened. Yes, but there have been newspaper stories about honour killings and, you know, exorcisms and, you know, paedophile mullahs and things, but these happen over decades in the whole of Britain, not in one town in the space of years. So it's problematic, but the writing is very good. So I think authenticity is a bit of a problematic term.
Yeah, and the writing itself is the main thing, right, Madeline?
I think the approach that I come from in attempting to sort of mine the textual detail of the novels that I'm looking at is really that many of the writers, they're brighter than that. They foreground questions of authenticity within their novels, and that will be an authenticity that is linked to Islam and also to being Pakistani, and that is actually part of the fabric of their novels and the way that they're constructed. If you think of The Reluctant Fundamentalist, for example, or they will foreground to a certain extent their own elitism. Kamila Shamsi does that in the sense of that her characters are often interrogating their own sort of dichotomous perspectives.
Constantly.
So I don't think we need to worry too much about that in the sense of that not being apparent. On the other hand, I think there are questions of authenticity that are troubling. For example, I've just been writing about Mohsen Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and how a novel like that came out at same time in the UK as other memoirs and so on, like The Islamist by Ed Hussein, which talks about his journey inside fundamental Islam and how he saw the light and came out, such a thing, and has been described as one that should be prescribed like medicine for for the British government and civil service, apparently. The Reluctant Fundamentalist was coming out at a similar time, and I've just been exploring a work from a journal called Psychology and History, which actually takes the case of Changé as a case study for radicalized mindset alongside a real individual, and actually the case of Ed Hussein, which is highly problematic because this is a fictional character who, in my reading of that novel, absolutely plays with these questions and the frictions around whether he may or may not be a fundamentalist and whether that's American market capitalism or Islamic militancy. So again, I think this engagement with these questions of authenticity is there in the novels. The problem is perhaps whether we choose to pick it up or whether we want to see them as something we can that can be prescribed like medicine.
I think we do have time for some brief questions. First you and then you. Can we have the mic, please? Yeah. I think the discussion has gone on pretty well.
Yes, I'm just interested in knowing, how your readings tell you this whole idea about Pakistan or Pakistaniyat is changing, with this literature coming up. I see it going back into ideological foundation as well, but it's moving ahead as well. So how do you look at that? Pakistan being changed as an image.
Okay. Madeline or Claire, who's going to... Yeah, please, go ahead.
Well, in a sense, that's I'm not sure I can give an answer to that now. If you ask me in a couple of months, I might be able to. In a sense, that's what I'm doing now. I'm sorry, I can't see where there's... hello, yes. When I leave this festival tomorrow and return to the National College of Arts in Lahore, what I will be doing is looking at the work that's being produced by the students there, the visual art, trying to marry up what they choose to represent with what is being represented by these global Pakistani writers in English, and see what the similar themes are and what the differences is. But certainly what I've been seeing on a local level is that whereas I've been questioning this need to write about terror and violence for a Western audience, and whether that is placing an undue burden on Pakistani writers in English today, I've been questioning that, and many others have, from where I'm coming from. But at the same time, the first thing I do when I walk into the quad at the NCA is to see representations of violence, differently negotiated, but a real desire to talk about the problems within Pakistan society, as far as I can see, to one another, to encourage a discourse within the civil society here. And this is what I seem to be reading in Dawn, calls for that in Dawn as well. So where is this art at? Maybe the global and the local is not so different, but the audience is different.
Certainly.
I'm not sure.
That's a very important distinction. And probably the last question for the day. You had a question? Yeah.
Okay, I'm Faisal Nazir from English Department, University of Karachi. I actually had a number of questions. I'm doing my PhD on a similar topic to yours, and I've got your book, British Muslim Fictions, with me. Over here, I've been reading this. Referring to what we have been talking about, the question of authenticity, I think this is a wrong question to ask of a literary work. It's more biographical in nature than textual. Probably we should be looking for elements of sympathy. Whether a person is a Muslim or a non-Muslim, Pakistani or Indian, whatever subject or character one creates or treats of should be created with sympathy. And what I have read so far in many of these writers, that most of the religious characters are portrayed in a very stereotypical manner. religious-minded characters, practicing Muslims and so on. So this is where I think
May I
sympathy.
request you to please come to the question because we have to wind up the session. There are people
The
signaling.
question is that, is this authenticity, or should we be looking for the sympathy rather than authenticity? Because it could be from anywhere.
All right.
Okay, I think probably the questions I should start because you've got my book and I can't believe it's in Pakistan. Great. I think it might be just these 2 copies anywhere, but so that's great. So I think it's a really good question. I think you're right that ultimately the textual is a lot more important than the autobiographical. In fact, in a way, Madeline answered the question with her idea that questions of authenticity are staged in many of the novels, and writers complicate their own position through, reflecting on the position of the author or the position of the elite character. I think this idea of sympathy or maybe empathy is a really interesting one. I think you're right that a lot of religious characters are portrayed in pretty one-dimensional ways, certainly from Pakistani writers in English. I think from my project, the British Muslim writers actually, especially I think Robin Yassin Kassab's novel, the religious character is one of the most attractive characters in The Road from Damascus, Muntaha, wears hijab, she's very thoughtful, she's chosen to wear it. It's pretty positive, and Sami, the very secular character, is actually an idiot, quite frankly. And so it's sort of an about turn, and that makes it a very interesting novel. I can't think of I think perhaps in Burnt Shadows, there's a complication of assumptions about religious characters, but I don't know, off the top of my head if I can think of a really good portrayal. But Layla Abu Layla is another one, the Sudanese writer, who does complicate that.
Yeah, we could probably go on and discuss these in more detail, but I guess we have to take a rather abrupt stop because we have run out of time. So I'd like to begin by thanking Claire and Madeline and the audience for bearing with us in this discussion. Thank you.